acres were added into iView, so folks can incorporate those lands into their conservation planning. I want to thank the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation for their support of this project, as well as the Illinois Department of Natural Resources for getting us the information that we needed on the Conservation Reserve Enhancement contracts. Related to that, we were able to get out our 2020 year in review, which is the masterpiece that David Holman puts together every year that talks about all the accomplishments that the land trust and conservation community does. And you'll be hearing about from Dave about that report very soon. And I'm again thrilled that PSCC was able to play a role in getting that out. This year we hosted, this last fall, we hosted some training opportunities for members. We offered 3 leadership workshops that were focused, included sessions focused on leading yourself, leading others, and leading organizations. We had 28 members take part in those workshops. And I want to recognize the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation for their help in bringing those workshops to you as well. We've been preparing for the launch of the Natural Areas Stewardship Act, which is the grant program the DNR is putting together that's going to allow land trusts to do contractual steward to get grants to do work on properties that are enrolled in the nature preserve system. We've been keeping a close eye on this and trying to make sure that members are ready for this when it comes out. And to that end, Ann Holtrip from the Department of Natural Resources is going to be speaking tomorrow. And one of the things that she'll be talking about is the Natural Areas Stewardship Act and the new grant program. We tried as far as announcements from PSCC, we tried a different approach this year. Rather than putting together a regular newsletter that doesn't seem to always, things don't always line up in terms of timing when things need to get out or when you've got the newsletter. So we switched to more of a periodic push, I would say, on things, trying to get them out to members when the timing was right. That resulted in about 2 announcements, 2 email blasts per month to members. And I'd be really interested in any feedback from members on that. Is that too much? Is that too little? What do you think are sort of the best way for the organization, the coalition, to get you information? So if you've got ideas or comments on that, I'd be happy to receive those. You could send them to me by email, or you can also drop them into the chat here as well. But I'd be really interested in some feedback on that. And last, and certainly not least, is our work on the strategic plan, and in particular, the business plan. Last year, we reported on the completion of a new strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan for the organization. And a major component of that strategic plan, as I mentioned earlier, was a desire to move from a volunteer-run organization to one that's led by a full-time executive director. That's a big switch for us. And in order to try and help us figure out how we could make that transition, we hired the Spectrum Nonprofit Services Group to come in and create a business plan for us. And we've been working with Steve Schrang from Spectrum on that business plan. The idea is to, again, help us put together the business background and plan on how we would raise the funds and support the new executive director for the organization. That was a highlight that was raised in our most recent strategic plan. Steve's done some really good work on that, and in just a minute I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to run through where we're at. And then when it comes time, the one thing that we do want to do is, given some of the things that have gone on in the last year or two, we are going to take a very quick sort of revisit, if you will, to the strategic plan, in particular in 2 areas. In DEI with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We just want to make sure that we've got what we want in there, given some of the increased recognition of that within the conservation community. So we're going to take a quick look at that. And then I'm sure you're all aware of some of the changes that have gone on with VLI and we want to take a quick look at the changes there and see if that creates any openings or opportunities for PSCC. So then once we get go back and revisit the strategic plan and make sure we've got sort of scoped out well what an executive director would focus on, then we can wrap up this business plan and hopefully get launching on trying to make that a reality. And with that, I'm going to introduce Steve Strang, who, as I mentioned, is our consultant who's been working with us, and Steve's going to run us through the plan. So take it away, Steve.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim, for having me, and great to connect with everybody. I know some of you I've talked to, and some will be new voices, so it's exciting to connect with everybody here. Let me share my screen here. Whoops, 1 second. And we're going to run through just a couple slides. The one thing I will say, just as a preface here, is I've created this for presentation's sake. There's a much longer report that has a lot of the data and backstory to how we got here. You know, Jim, I'll kind of leave that to you and the board to how to share some of that. There's nothing top secret in there, but it is a lot of back data and information and some market research that I'll touch on verbally. But just for time's sake, I'm not going to go through all that here. But like Jim said, so this process is really, let me go here, was really set up to do 3 different pieces. And I'll walk through each of these in just a second. I am going to kind of go through all 10 or so pages, 12 pages of this. If questions come up during this, jump in the chat, but I'm going to try to leave a couple minutes to answer any questions. And then the second component to this is questions that come out of today and the rest of this week. There'll be a revision on that report and this work to make sure we incorporate all of that. And Jim and I have connected about some of those that have come up, as he just mentioned as well. But this project really focused on 3 different areas with the outcome of thinking about what does a model for PSCC look like staffing wise moving forward. And a part of that, the biggest part to start us off was talking around impact. So what does the impact of PSCC look like as a staffed organization? We then used a tool to understand the current business model and what a business model would look like, or what a program model would look like with an executive director. And then we went through and broke out 3 different models of possible staffing and have narrowed it down to 1 model. And I'll walk through the 1 model that we landed on, and I'll discuss the other 2 that we did not as we move forward in this presentation. So the 2 big pieces we started this process off with were tools that we call intended impact and a matrix map. Intended impact is kind of our beacon internal strategy statement. And we wanted to understand, where does the organization what does the organization want its outcome to be, especially thinking with an executive director? And we'll talk about how we got there in a second, and I'll share that statement. We use that as kind of our beacon and our impact statement to then help us create a matrix map, which we mapped out all of the programs, both from a financial standpoint and also a program impact standpoint, and created a graphic, which I'll walk through in a second. The reason that we did these 2 steps first is we wanted to lay a foundation to say, where does the organization want to be with an executive director? Then we can say, okay, the best model to do that is X, Y, and Z, or with full-time staff, I guess is a better way to phrase that. Then we looked at staffing models to match and said, you know, if the organization's impact is X and our business model is Y, what is the best model to make that happen? And where we landed on with the impact statement is we use this statement, here's where we landed, and we use this statement, as you can see here, as the description, as a statement, a series of statements about what the organization is trying to achieve and for what it will hold itself accountable for in some manageable period of time. It also identifies both the benefits of the organization and what it seeks to provide to those beneficiaries. And we spent some time both at our first and second board conversations breaking this out. And where we landed was a phrase saying, working with member organizations through facilitated learning, networking, and collaboration, PSCC strengthens conservation efforts in Illinois. I've kind of broke out the 4 different components of that, of who we work with, the strategies we're going to take to get there, the impact strengthening conservation efforts, and where we impact Illinois. And I think this, it's how 20 words or whatever, it's one statement, but there's a lot to take away from this, from PSCC and from this organization. And I think the biggest one you should think about is the phrase land trust is not in this statement. And one of the big shifts, and we'll dig into this more and more through this process, is the idea of how do land trusts play into PSCC moving forward? Are they the vehicle for impact, or are they the outcome of our impact? And what we're really saying here is that member organizations are really the means to that end. The outcome of our work at PSCC is to strengthen conservation efforts. Now, land trusts are one of our strategies. I'll talk about that in a second. So we're not, the land trust piece is not lost, but I think one of the big things to think about, and it's a little foreshadowing on the organization moving forward, is that impact on strengthening conservation efforts in Illinois. There's a lot of ways that can happen. And what we're saying here is the outcome of our work is really around strengthening those conservation efforts. The second piece we did, and I mentioned this earlier, was we created a matrix map. And I'll leave this text up here for a second if people want to read through it. But the matrix map is a tool that we use at Spectrum and other organizations, but we created this tool at Spectrum that maps out all of the programs an organization does, and maps them out in 2 different ways. It maps them out from a profitability standpoint. So is a program bringing in profit, or is it subsidized through other activities? And the second piece is, does this program provide impact to the organization, specifically that intended impact, which we'll talk about in a second. And we take those 2 data points, profitability and impact, and we map those out on a 4-quadrant graphic like you see here. Programs that are profitable and have high impact fall into the star category, which are outlined there. Programs that are high mission impact and low profitability fall in our heart category, which are most nonprofit programs. Programs that are high profitability but low mission impact fall in our money tree category. And then programs that fall in our low mission impact, low profitability are in our stop sign category. The impact score, and I'll talk more about this when I show the graphic in a second, is determined through a survey. We did this from the board perspective of 4 different impact measures. And we took the scores of all the board members, merged them together into 1 score. Each program has 1 score of impact and 1 score of profitability. And we put all that on 1 map. And I'll get that in just 1 second. One other piece that we did unique to PSCC that we don't do in most cases is we knew the outcome of this project was to think about, what does PSCC look like with an executive director? And so we put a caveat in this process to say, we might not know what the profitability of that program is if it's a new program, but what would we want the impact of that program to be if it was ran by if there was a full-time executive director? And then we had the board members score current and future programming based on the idea of, if there was full-time staff running this, so more capacity, how much impact would you expect those programs to have? Part of the reason we did that is it allowed us to see where the focus of the board's thoughts were. If there is an executive director, where would they expect to see gains in impact within the program portfolio? So some programs jumped a little bit, some jumped a lot. I'll show that in a second, as I just mentioned, but it was important for us to get an idea of where do we think the board's, where's the board's thoughts on what the executive director should be doing and what the organization should be doing programmatically when there is full-time staff. So where we landed is on a map that looks like this. There's 4 quadrants. We have our star quadrant here, just to map these out, our heart quadrant there, our money tree quadrant here, which does have donations, and then our stop sign quadrant down here. And what this map is telling us is two different, what you're also seeing here is two different pieces that I didn't talk about in the last page. Each program that PSCC takes part in is mapped out here. Some are future programs, shared services, webinars, doing more programs. But some, like you would expect the annual meeting and conference to be on here, should be recognizable programs. The one other piece to that is the size of the bubble is the current expenses or the current resources that are devoted to that program. And so you can see right now the program that receives the most essentially attention from PSCC, should be no surprise, the annual meeting, conference and training, followed by iView, which is over here, the Hike app, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece to this that I want to, the other big takeaway from this, outside of seeing how big the conference training was, is how important the board felt membership would be with expanded capacity of full-time staff. The greens, where this green bubble is right here, whoops, is where the bubble landed without full-time staff, so current programming. The black bubble here is where the impact should be with full-time staff. So for each of these, that black bubble that you see is where the jump would be if full-time staff were hired. Well, for membership, that's a huge jump. That's, you know, I think it's almost a point on a 4-point scale, 20 or so % jump in impact. Each program has a significant jump. Membership had a big jump there. So it was interesting to see the board's focus on membership moving forward, which ties into that impact statement that I mentioned earlier, which I'll jump back to, that shows the member organizations are really important to how we are going to accomplish our impact. It was the first, essentially the first piece of our intended impact statement is working with member organizations. And in the matrix map, we could see that member organizations were a focus of where the board's thoughts are, especially once we hire an executive director. It's one of the top couple different programs if you're to look at impact, which again is this axis here. So higher these programs are up on our vertical axis, the more impact those programs have. And so membership is going to be seen as a very important part of impact, along with the annual meeting, iView, advocacy, and webinars. So as we started thinking about, okay, so our intended impact has a membership focus, our matrix map shows how important membership is, and also that we continue to, we expect our annual meeting, iView, and some of our other programs to grow in impact. That takes a lot of capacity to do. And so as I started thinking about what are the options for staffing, you know, an executive director can be part-time and contractual. So there's a lot of different models. But what we're saying here with not only the intended impact, but the matrix map is we expect our programs to have more impact, which takes more time, and membership is very important in that growth. So both important points when we start thinking about what does that model look like. So a couple different pieces of our takeaways. I've mentioned some of these, but I did put a summary slide here just as a couple, like I said, a couple different takeaways. Most programs gain an impact scores with an executive director in place. I think that's really important. There's questions on what should we be doing with the Hike app moving forward. That's probably a whole nother 30-minute conversation we could have, but that was obviously one of the big takeaways that we had during this process. But also, you know, questions on how do webinars engage, how do we make those important pieces to the organization? And then also what is driving profitability as the organization grows, which we'll touch on as we go through the rest of this. So going through that process of the matrix map, of intended impact, and then also having discussions with the board and some other board member and some other stakeholders. What we came up with was, what does a model for PSCC look like in kind of this phase 2 of hiring an executive director? And we came up with a couple different pieces, and I'll walk through that here. You can see it on the summary, but I'll go to the next page, which breaks it out a little more clearly. What our takeaways were for this process is the mission of the organization is not changing. We've identified what the intended impact is around strengthening conservation efforts. And that led us to breaking out kind of 4 big strategies for the organization moving forward. That number one, we're supporting land trust operations throughout Illinois. So we touched on Illinois being PSCC being a statewide organization. The second, we provide educational opportunities to strengthen conservation efforts. So again, this conservation efforts piece being really important to that. We're an advocate for Illinois land conservation. And the fourth being, we connect leaders to tools, organizations, opportunities, and resources to improve conservation efforts. Yes, part of that is going to be through the land trust piece, but also the expansion of who we possibly work with to connect those tools, resources, and opportunities with. So as this was the model for our organization moving forward, the intended impact piece there, these 4 strategies, we had a couple different options of what a model would look like for staffing moving forward. I'll talk about the one we landed on in a second, but there was options from partnering with organizations to become programs and having somebody there run PSCC, not a well-received option, which understandably so. There was options around hiring contractual workers to run the organization. There was different, we ran through 3 very specific and a couple other options that we saw out there. And the one we ended up landing on was this option of membership expansion with a full-time executive director. So Jim brought up earlier this idea that PSCC wanted to hire an executive director. I did not come into this process with the notion that we have to have traditional full-time executive director as the structure for this. We went through the process and vetted some other options. And I think where we landed is, yes, the idea is executive director for PSCC as a staff member, with the idea of the membership expansion model to make that happen. I'll break this down in just a second of what that looks like. The other piece that I'm not going to go through for time's sake of how we started to get here and where a big conversation was with the board is we did do market research to understand what are other states doing. Wisconsin has an interesting model. There's an interesting model in South Carolina where they're a part of another organization. There's an organization in Oregon, and that was the one that we spent the most time on that kind of in some ways looks like PSCC wants to look in 5 or 10 years from now, where they started out where PSCC is today, had some seed money and have now grown that organization. We looked at a lot of different models and ended up kind of digging more in conversation into what Oregon had, which in some ways is this idea of membership expansion and hiring full-time staff with some seed money. And now they've grown beyond just one executive director. But the model that we've landed on is really this idea of membership expansion with an executive director in place. And you can see the title of what I called this is not executive director. The title of this is membership expansion, because that is how we're going to get to this executive director role as a full-time role. So as we started understanding what are the business models and what is the business model, what is the focus of programs, and what are the revenue levers that this organization could pull to pay for this, it ended up coming down to this idea of expansion of contributions to the organization. So a couple bullet points there. Membership is expanded with a philanthropic lens to support the mission of the organization, not necessarily just to provide member benefits. Membership groups are aggressively expanded outside of land trust into supportive organizations, individuals, and others, which I have a slide on in just a second. Resources and staffing are focused on the expansion of memberships and advocacy of mission initially. Programming expansion, at least in the short term, would really still depend on the land trust volunteers, board members, and contractors, because the focus of that staff member is really thinking advocacy and expansion of membership. And the executive director skill set, which we'll talk more about, is really focused on gaining support throughout the state, both philanthropic support, but advocacy support and membership, increasing that membership base. There were some questions that were asked. I left them in here for those who have been on some of the or some of the project calls. Some questions that came up from my standpoint and others, is there enough possible members to make this feasible? Are there too many organizations vying for the same contribution and membership? And can this organization scale beyond initial growth in the first of what it is now or in the first year? Some of those questions were answered. I do think there are some questions still there. One of the questions that was not resolved at the time of the last presentation here was the vital lands question, which ties into the second. So I think some of that has either been solved or more questions have now been arisen from that change. So still some questions, but I think those questions where we landed are manageable questions and not really stopping this this model from being from working for PSCC. So where running with that model, where that led to is what would say a 3-year plan of this, what would be different in 3 years from where we are today? And in starting to sketch out what an organization would look like, this membership focus organization, programming would catch up eventually, but with an initial focus on advocacy, gaining support for PSCC and expanding membership around the state. We would be from year 0, which I'm calling year 0 today because we're not really even into that first year. The main funding source for this model would really be how do we get some seed money from an initial or a group of initial donors to help us move this forward. We would be hiring an executive director to make that happen. The current board structure is really the land trust representatives, and I'll talk about what that the next phase in just a second. With no sort of advisory board. I know there are advisors, but formal advisory board. The programmatic focus is land trust support. I think that still stays a piece of the pie, but right now that's the main programmatic focus. And the membership makeup is majority land trust organizations. Thinking about what would PSCC look like with this model moving forward and hiring an executive director. Hiring an executive director, I'll come to that question in a second. Sorry, I was blinking. We're thinking about year 3 of this organization would be membership and contributions would be the main funding source. That might, what that looks like numbers wise, well, we can discuss, but that being a big focus to get up to what a ramping up year 3 would look like. Staffing structure would be that executive director, possibly some administrative support, whether staff or consultant administrative support. I think the next biggest change that came up both in conversation, but also both in expansion of mission for PSCC and impact is thinking, what does the board look like moving forward? And it's really thinking conservation ambassadors from around the state, not just the land trust executive directors moving forward. That said, I think there's an advisory role for those land trust the land trust leadership that wants to be involved, but not in a board role, that there is some sort of advisory board, especially thinking about our programs and our program base and advocacy role in the state around how do the land trust play an advisory role to the organization without having to feel like they need to be on the board moving forward. The programmatic focus, moving a little bit more conservation focused, but still with that land trust support being a piece of the pie. The land trust really playing that vehicle role, not the outcome role that we discussed. And membership being a much more diverse makeup of individuals, corporations, organizations, thinking about membership as more of a philanthropic endeavor as a program development endeavor for the organization. So where that led us is to start thinking about what would a revenue strategy look like for the organization. And there's just a couple pieces left, then I'll open it up. And I know there's at least one or a couple questions here to answer. One of the biggest unanswered questions, and one of the biggest questions, and it's still not totally answered because of some expense questions we'll talk about in a second, is what would a revenue strategy, what would the actual numbers look like from a revenue strategy? Now, I'm sticking to my where we landed earlier in thinking this membership support as a philanthropic endeavor is an initial strategy that needs to be undertaken for the revenue strategy. But all that said, when we think about what is the role of an executive director for, say, the next 3 years, and I've highlighted it here, revenue generation and revenue strategy need to be either the or a big focus of an executive director that is brought on by PSCC. In my opinion, and I explained it a little bit here, PSCC is not looking for a land trust expert to hire as their executive director. What PSCC is looking for is an executive director to expand the network of organizations looking to improve conservation efforts in Illinois. Obviously, the understanding of what land trusts do and understanding of their role in the state is important, but we're not necessarily looking for an expert, a lawyer to come in that has a land trust background to come in and run PSCC. You're really looking for an ambassador or a cheerleader of land conservation efforts that can rally the troops and expand your membership base and play a role in advocacy. Because as of right now, the programmatic expertise is there with the land trust leadership and the volunteers that you have in place. You don't need to replicate that with the executive director. And so we've started breaking down what could this possibly look like, and using your current structure of membership, of the land trust expenses or the land trust membership, and looking at what your current membership costs are, expanding and modifying on what those might be. We kind of made up a couple different categories that could be appealing for for new members. And we mocked up, if we're to raise $100,000, and it could be, maybe it's 150. We'll talk about what expenses look like in a second. One of the big takeaways that I gained from my conversations with board members is land trust members cannot be the sole factor of raising this money. We cannot raise the membership dues of the land trust to make up this difference. And so when we think about in tying this into needs and understanding of an executive director, we have to think about, okay, so what do the rest of those organizations look like? And what would be possible? What would be possible if we were to think about membership moving forward? And just to give you an idea, if we were to bring in $100,000, if we were to raise $100,000 and keeping that land trust number, I think this is a 2017 number or 2019 number, that membership was $7,000 from our land trust members. That's $90,000+ that has to come from elsewhere. Now, the conference and some others are also brought in some grant dollars. I'm not excluding that, but we would really think about a model where 40 or so percent, as you can see here, is tied up into membership, and that's a big ask for an executive director. And we'd have a 3-year time span to do that, but it has to be a pretty aggressive growth period if we are to focus on membership and contributions as our main revenue source, main revenue stream, I should say, for the organization moving forward. The other pieces that I will say is in that matrix map and with some full-time capacity, I think there's opportunity to grow the conference and sponsorship. There's opportunity for online education, which we saw as one of the bubbles. So I think there are other revenue sources available. But again, using that membership model, which the membership model is working now, so we're not recreating that for the organization, using what's been working and growing that and expanding that to government, nonprofit entities, any corporate members, and especially individual members, which really would appeal, which would really turn into more of an annual appeal structure of that you see at traditional fundraising, but framed in this membership frame around supporting conservation efforts in Illinois. So a couple of good questions. One of them, Lisa, you just asked a question that I'm going to touch on right now around value proposition. So thank you for teeing me up for that. One of the big questions that I think needs to be answered is around why PSCC. And maybe Lisa looked through my slides already and saw this slide was coming up, so I appreciate that. So not a final draft by any stretch, but I think one of the things that you PSCC members, PSCC board members, PSCC stakeholders need to think about, and take this draft as a starting point if you want, is to answer, why is PSCC the group that should be advocating for conservation efforts in Illinois? And so, from our standpoint, and I'm not going to dig into the theory around why I put in here, but we really started to break out a case for support, outlining a little bit of the mission. I think this is probably more of a 2-page document than a 1-slide, 4-paragraph document, but breaking out what is the mission of the organization. What PSCC has already done, I think, needs to be highlighted. PSCC has really been doing this for years through the lens of land trust, and it's worked. So let's expand that throughout the state, keeping the same model of our membership model, but expanding that to other organizations throughout the state. The idea that land trust cannot do this alone, I think, is important. Understanding and breaking out that, we've gone through this process, and we think an executive director will help set us up for a statewide, more statewide support, continuing to grow our network, the advocacy, and bringing that voice for our important natural land resources. And then also highlighting that, one thing that was really talked about a lot in my conversations with PSCC stakeholders was this idea that there's other models out there that can be partners, and there's a lot of partners in the state that we can work with. So PSCC in some ways is moving, if you think about the hub and spoke model of PSCC being a part of that pie, PSCC is really trying to move themselves to the middle of that pie to say, we are going to be that main player in conservation efforts for Illinois. Moving from just maybe, quote, just the land trust model, where we have now the land trust model, and we have a little bit of a bigger voice throughout the whole state because of this statewide membership group that we have got to buy into our model. And so, Lisa, to answer your question, in some ways, I think there is a value proposition of PSCC, and I think I've started sketching that out here. One of the first things I think that has to be fleshed out, and I know there's some board members that have taken an interest to this, is sketching out a more formal case for support or value proposition of why PSCC. I do think it's there because of the success that's been done and some of the gaps now with Vital Lands leaving. So I think that's there, but just needs to be sketched out just a little bit more. And the last piece, and then I'll answer any other questions and open it back up. As I was going through this, there's 2 questions that hovered over my head that I couldn't answer as an outside voice. And I think they're really step 2 questions anyways to this. And there's 2 questions that have been brought up that Jim brought up earlier that I'll touch on also. One of the challenges with building exact revenue projections for this process was I have a hard time knowing exactly what the expenses are going to be for PSCC for, I'll say, year 2 and year 3. One of the reasons is I think there needs to be a discussion on how can member land trusts support a phase 2 of this organization. Is there space that can be given pro bono for a little while? Is there technology that can be supported and systems that can be supported? None of those have to happen. PSCC can start at 0, find an office and technology and staff, etc. But I think there needs to be a question of, is there a phasing in process where an executive director can be housed somewhere and use a computer somewhere to save on expenses in year 1 and build that up to a year 3, a more sustainable model. So I think when we think about what does revenue have to be, there's a bigger question for me on what are the expenses going to be through that 3-year build-up process. And the second piece for me is really thinking about that job description for the executive director. And I see somebody in the chat, somebody chatted me and said, fund development seems like an important skill for the executive director. And if I was in the shoes of PSCC, the PSCC board looking for an executive director, it may or may not be fund development, but it will be network building and someone who's comfortable just grinding it out, meeting with people, selling the story. In some ways, it's kind of a sales pitch of PSCC for 3 years. it may not be what you think a traditional executive director needs to look like from an operational standpoint and program expertise. You really need to get somebody who's going to grow the network of PSCC. And maybe in 3 or 4 years, that person's in a different role in the organization and they're not the executive director, but you need someone who kind of plays that cheerleader role. And the part that we didn't get into this is there's a question for me in the job description of what are the cultural elements of PSCC that we didn't touch on here, but need to be brought up in the job description. And so that's another question for the board and for the organization moving forward that we didn't talk about. The culture of the organization is important. You can hire based on skills and this and that. There's another element that you can't really capture until you either start interviewing or talking to some people that you have to figure out during that process. The last point I'll make, and trying to run through this is both thoroughly and quickly as possible, is there are questions about the DEI into hiring and culture and operations moving forward that were not a part of this. And also during this process, the last bullet point there is changes to the vital lands. Changes to vital lands happened during this process. And, there was conversations early around what does Vital Lands do? And now we're at a point of that organization is in a very different place than it was when this started. So looking back on the previous 9-10 slides, are there changes that have to be made, or are there opportunities there that we can jump on now that maybe we would have waited on with Vital Lands being around? And I think that should be discussed both in your strategic plan, but also when we think about this moving forward. So I'm going to actually go back to this slide and just leave this up. There's a couple different questions here, and I'm going to look on my other slide here just a second. Was there an analysis of analysis of other nonprofit organizations with similar missions? Were they a part of the market analysis? Yes and no. We really looked at other statewide land trust groups for the most part. Now, the question that comes up, and Lisa, I think this is what you're referring to. One of the questions that came up, maybe this is where you asked it, is around, are there too many organizations vying for same contributions and memberships? This came up in conversation. It was my takeaway that there still is a place for PSCC here, and that the bigger question was, what would our model look like, as opposed to what are the competitors or contributors out there? I think that should be looked at, but it wasn't a huge part of this because it didn't seem like one of the bigger hurdles for us moving forward. And I talked about the fund development piece and value proposition. So there's a couple other questions that have come in around the cultural elements of what I mean here when I'm hiring an executive director. I think there's just questions, just to briefly answer that. I think there's elements of PSCC and land trust culture that you all are familiar with that I'm not familiar with. Part of that is thinking about the DEI, but also part of that is thinking about what does the structure of that job look like? Are there parts of the state that we should be focusing on and recruiting from? There's just questions about land trust that I'm not a land trust expert. So anything tied to that profession that's not mentioned here should just be brought into that job description. So with that, I'm going to try to keep you guys on task. I'm going to pause here. Jim, I don't know if there's anything. Jim, you and I have talked a lot. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say. I know I ran through a lot. I ran through 18 months of work in 30 minutes there. So.
All right. Well, I just want to say thanks, Steve, for joining us today and presenting this. I think, as both Steve and I have mentioned, that this is a very big step for the organization trying to, move forward down this path. I think the plan that Steve's developed for us really helps chart a good course for us, giving us a model that we can work from. As Steve just pointed out, there's still a couple of important questions, that we need to wrestle with, but I think we've identified what those key questions are. And again, so I think we've really advanced the ball down the court on this. And it's a big step. So, I mean, this is going to continue to be an important item that the board will continue to talk about, as well as, keeping our members informed in what's going on. And so I think I'll just sort of pause there and just say, again, I think we've made great strides in the last year, and I think we're on a great path for trying to make bringing on a staff person a reality for the organization.
Great. Well, I'll say thanks to you and all the other board members. I know I see Paul and some others on here that have sat on my ramblings for hours. So I appreciate those who took a part in that, took a role in that, in the board meeting, which pre-COVID, which seems like 20 years ago now, not only a year or so ago, but I appreciate that. And, if questions come out of the next couple of days, Jim, I'll kind of leave that to you to reach back out. I'll update my things on my end, and then I'll also kind of leave you with sharing any of the other research with the group that's interested at that point as well.
That sounds great, Steve. And then I'll also just, for the members, as Steve said, we've hit you with a lot of information here. And so as you think about this a little more and ideas come, send them in, send them to me. I'll pass them along to the board, and we will continue to factor those, into our discussions as we move forward.
Perfect. Well, with that, I'll keep you guys on task and keeping on. I know you got a tight schedule, and this is the first thing, so we don't want to get behind day one, thing one. So thanks, Jim. I'll jump off and have a good rest of the meeting. And it was great working with you guys. And I know, Jim, we'll catch up in the near future here.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Steve.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Steve and Jim. Next up is Mr. David Holman. He needs no introduction. Dave, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start a new recording. So if you could give me 10 seconds, and then we'll be ready to go.
Ryan, I will take the opportunity. I agree. I think Dave doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to take the opportunity to do it nonetheless. Most of you know, but Dave is an independent conservation professional. He works with PSCC, other individual land efficiency, authorizing baseline and current conditions reports, and he's the creator of the Illinois Protected Natural Areas Natural Lands Database and accompanying iView platform. And so, again, he's no stranger to our group. Welcome, David, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. That made me sound far more impressive than I am. I am following up on a pretty awesome presentation, and I can't hope to equal that, but I would like to look back before we look forward, because looks like PSCC is going to great places. But before we do that, let's look at what happened in 2020 and just to a small extent where we might be going in the next couple of years with a plan that I think most of you have heard of. So this is probably going to be pretty familiar to a lot of folks looking at that, a lot of folks watching this presentation. As you can see, 2020 was a reasonably good year. I mean, it was not great, but given that we all almost died from the plague, things are actually looking surprisingly strong. One of the things that surprised me last year is that even though the amount of land protected was pretty small, as you can see, smallest since I've been tracking this in 2014, the number of projects did not really change. I think it was almost identical to the number of projects we had in 2019, which was one of the best years in history. So we had smaller projects, but they were very strategic in their location and in their size. I'm going to review a couple of those. But before I do so, I just wanted to touch on a few projects that I don't have this in this presentation, but that I think were really, really neat. And if you haven't looked at the annual report that I sent out a couple months ago, really suggest that you take a gander at it. Don't read the whole thing. It's really long and it's really boring. But there's a couple of sites. I want to start with the property on the Illinois River. It's owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. And that's an organization that a lot of folks probably haven't heard of because they've been absent from Illinois since I got into the business. but they returned in grand style last year. And it's an entity, an organization that I'm looking forward to working with a lot in the coming years. Of all the different land trusts in the state, very few are focused on archaeological resources, Joe Davies Conservation Foundation being the most notable. And having Archaeological Conservancy back in Illinois again, I think is going to fill a pretty big hole in just the network of projects that we often focus on. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the latest addition to Hackmatack, the National Wildlife Refuge that, as anyone who will listen knows, I never thought would get off the ground. And I was very, very wrong. Hackmatack expanded again last year thanks to open lands. And here's a little bit of a news flash. Last week, growing again, this time on the Wisconsin border. But let's look at a couple
David,
projects. Yeah.
David, this is Carrie. Sorry to interrupt you. I don't know. Are you sharing other slides? But we're still
No,
on.
I was not showing, I did not have
Okay.
slides for those particular projects. I just wanted to touch on them before I went into the slides that I do have in this presentation.
Okay, thanks.
But on that note, let's look at some of those projects. These are some of my favorite macro projects, macro sites, if you want, if you prefer, that we come back to year after year after year. I'm going to start with the one on the left because I know the Grand Prairie Friends is on this call today, on this webinar today. They've been growing the Warbler Ridge Conservation Area for the last, I think, 6 or 7 years. And last year, they continued that expansion, but it was both strategic and revelatory at the same time. Strategic because they picked up properties that provide improved access, that southern little pinprick that you see there, and a site that they're going to use for their office. And that's just not something that we've seen in the past. And one of the reasons I was really excited. I'm also really enthused by the parcel in the far north. You can see that they're just expanding the area of this macro conservation unit. For those who don't recall, Grand Prairie Friends owns the stuff in the green, and the stuff in the teal are owned by the city of Charleston on the north and the IDNR in the south. So they are really knitting together a very large conservation space. And that's the same thing that we see over on the right-hand side with the Kankakee National Wildlife and Fish Refuge, or at least the future Kankakee National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. This is something that the Friends of the Kankakee has been expanding, and expanding, that's the wrong word. They created it. Let's be honest. They created this wildlife refuge. They've been doing it for about 20 years, and they are knitting together lands owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, property that they gave to them in that the northwestern corner of that map, and by the Indiana DNR, Indiana TNC, and then Illinois DNR. And all of that land that you see there in the middle that I'm focusing on, those are parcels they've been acquiring piece by piece. It's usually like a quarter acre, half an acre at most, piece by piece for 20 years. And everything in yellow was added last year, and they are continuing to expand this. And I want to close just on this section of the presentation with what I thought was 2020's most innovative land project. That is an agricultural field. They are growing corn and soybeans. It's not even organic ag, but it is the most awesome land project of last year from my perspective. And this is why. They are using, this is Illinois Audubon Society. IAS is using this project, is using this land to fund their work throughout the state. And Jim, if I get any of this wrong, please come off mute and correct me. I like this project because it addresses one of the big challenges, not only for PSCC, but for all of its members, and that's sustainability. This is a property that was donated to IAS with the idea that they would be able to use the resources, use the income from the farm to fund whatever projects need to be funded, be it land acquisition, be it restoration, be it management. I'm hoping that this is the sort of thing we can see expanded throughout the state with other land trusts, where we have a continual revenue stream. This is the first, hoping it's not going to be the last. Now with 2020 done, I want to look ahead to 2030 and the 30 by 30 plan. I had never heard of this. I had no idea what this was. And then, I don't know, last August, September, I started getting a multitude of calls and emails from high school biology teachers, from political advocacy organizations, asking about Illinois' place in the 30 by 30 project and program. I had to look into this. I'm like, oh, okay, this is actually pretty neat. 30% of America should be preserved by the year 2030. That's including lands and waters for those of you who aren't involved in this. And everyone was asking me, how can we do that in Illinois? Well, what do we have to do? And I gave this some thought. And I came to the conclusion that, yeah, it's a great idea, but perhaps we should look at what we have in the state and what we can get to. The Shawnee National Forest is the largest protected piece of land in Illinois. Something like 280,000 acres. I'm probably off by a couple thousand acres there. That's in the south. That is 0.8% of Illinois' land mass. We have an opportunity in this state, but we're not going to do 30%. Because 30% of Illinois would be the size of New Jersey. And if somebody can tell me how we're going to protect an area the size of New Jersey, I am all ears. But it's probably not going to happen. That said, there is a lot that we can do. And that's what I'm hoping that we can discuss during this meeting and in the days, weeks, and months to come. Can we hit 5%? Maybe. But to hit 5% in the next 10 years, this is what we'd have to protect. That is a whole lot of land. That's why I think a lot of this is going to come down to working with the agricultural community. Ag is something like 85% of Illinois. How can we work with that community, with municipalities, to get us where we want to be? Whatever that number is. Is it 4.5? Is it 5? Is it even more? Figure out what we can do, and then let's get going. And with that, I'm going to stop my ramblings and turn it over to someone who is a much better public speaker than I. Thank you much. And Ryan, that's your cue to take over.
All right, while we're waiting for Ryan, are there any questions for Dave on the report? Hopefully you've all had a chance to take a quick look at it.
I think there was a question from, anyway, was the land donated, Jim, from Illinois Audubon that Dave was referring to? Was it donated or purchased?
It was donated. Oh, I'll let Jim take this one, sorry.
Yeah, it was donated from actually a former board member who donated the land to us, restricted for stewardship and or acquisition. As Dave said, it's a working farm. So, I mean, it was land we own, not for conservation value, but simply as a revenue source. And so last year we cash rented it, and actually last month it sold at auction. And now we're going to use that to still under discussion, but most likely it's going to be used as a stewardship endowment for us going forward.
I had a question on that property. Did the easement include any parameters with regard to management practices, farming practices that would have less negative impact on pollinators, for example?
No, we did. We sold it free and clear, just as workable farmland. We had a great deal of discussion about that within our organization. And frankly, that was one of the reasons that we sold it, was that, I mean, that's not Illinois Audubon Society's mission. We're not into, trying to do a demonstration on sustainable farming. 160 acres isn't really much to make much of a difference on that. It just was out of our realm to try and go down that path. And frankly, we felt doing so, when every other farmer in the county is doing other practices, almost penalized ourselves, which was part of the reason I was uncomfortable holding it and farming it regular which is one of the reasons we decided to sort of sell it and use those proceeds to do conservation work.
Thanks.
Any other questions for David? All right, well, thanks again, David. Congratulations to everyone out there continuing to get our work done this year. And I really enjoyed and appreciated the perspective that you offered, big picture, David. Right now, we are scheduled for a 15-minute break. And during that break, there will be a short video that will be playing from one of our sponsors. And at the end of the break, we'll do our final session on the stakeholder engagement. I'll be hanging out in the main room. If anybody needs anything, please feel free to let me know.
Ryan, can we get some audio on this video at all, or?
Home whole and ensure the future of a world that sustains Earth.
Great, thanks.
Okay, folks, I'm going to start it over. I apologize for the lack of audio.
All good. Thanks, Ryan.
A stunning panorama of life. This is what drew most of us to conservation in the first place. But as the world has become ever more connected and complex, we've come to realize that while conservation is still about saving these animals and these places, it's also about us and our ability to ensure our own survival.
The Nature Conservancy has an extraordinary legacy of protecting land and water at an enormous scale. It Today, we realize that we can't protect nature just one place at a time. We have to work at multiple places around the globe to make a profound difference so that both people and nature thrive.
By 2050, global population is expected to grow to more than 9 billion people. The growing needs for food, water, and energy will tax our natural world as never before. At the same time, we face the threats of climate change, major biodiversity loss, and water scarcity. A new kind of conservation is needed.
We're using science to set our priorities, but really a whole new set of science that we haven't used before. We're having to look at economics, agronomy, and hydrology to help us see the whole scope of the challenges that we face and make sure we're doing the most effective, important things.
We believe that we can harness the awesome power of nature and renew our thriving planet.
We are focusing on the things that will have the greatest impact on our world. We're still committed to protecting land and water. We'll continue to protect critical ecosystems, especially ones that won't be protected unless we step up and do it. We're still in that business. We're also now in the business of addressing climate change, feeding the world sustainably, and bringing nature to cities. That's the TNC game plan for the big challenges ahead.
For this spectacular planet and all the life it holds, the clock is ticking. Only by working together can we give people hope. Keep our wildlife wild. Keep our home whole. And ensure the future of a world that sustains us all.
Okay, folks, hopefully everyone is making their way back. I've got 128. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Emily Taylor. Emily is the principal of Teeny Big, and she's passionate about helping nonprofits find better ways to engage the people who matter to them. She guides teams in stepping outside of their day-to-day work in order to create stronger connections with their audiences, turning lackluster followers into enthusiastic supporters. I think the buzzword for that one is going to be the engagement ladder that we're talking about today. Emily teaches organizations how to apply human-centered design, a process that reevaluates the experience of a product or services end user, and she designs and facilitates workshops to help teams understand and expand the user experience, and offers coaching to help further guide that practice. So at this point, I'm gonna turn over the screen to Emily to share her screen, and welcome, Emily.
Thanks, Ryan.
Oh,
Good
I
to,
need to,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I need to be a co-host.
Sorry about that. There you go.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. If you are here, I'd love to see your faces. This is intended to be an interactive. I think you just muted me. Were you ready for me to talk, Ryan?
Oh, yes, sorry.
That's okay. I don't somehow, I got, maybe as I became the co-host, I got muted. So yeah, this is intended to be an interactive session. So I'd love to be able to see your faces, have you participate. And in fact, the first way I'd love for you to participate is just, I'd love to know what, in the chat, what organizations you're from and what you're most excited about for spring. For me, you know, I am in Chicago, and I am really excited for planting some seedlings in the next coming weeks. We've got a new system, and so I'm really excited to get some nice healthy seedlings for my garden this year with my new stepped up process. All right, so now let me share my screen. Cool, we got Open Lands Conservation Foundation. Yes, warmth and sunshine. Okay, let me get my screen big here. All right, so yeah, let me just check out the chat. Awesome. So yeah, put if you're just coming in, put in the chat. I'd love to hear you know, what organization you're with and what you're most excited about for spring. Let's see. Yes, plants blooming. Let's see some other topics here. Cool. Great to hear where people are from. Forest Preserves of Winnebago, Conservation Foundation, some more open lands. Awesome. This is really great to hear where you guys are from. You know, as I mentioned, I'm in Illinois as well. And so I'm just so excited for the work that you're doing to make my state strong and better. And so I really appreciate the work that you do. Let's see. So welcome. This is going to be a stakeholder engagement workshop. And let me know too if everyone can hear me all right. What we're going to focus on today is really how you're engaging your stakeholders and some tools you can use to do that. And this is really, it's nice that this is part of the beginning of this conference, because I think you'll be able to apply some of the stuff that we're talking about to some of the other topics that are being covered over the next couple of days. But firstly, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we think about engagement. You know, if humans were robots, I think this all would be a lot easier. We'd know exactly what it took to engage people. You know, we would know how people would react to things we do. But they're not. People are complicated, and we don't really know exactly what makes them care, or if they do care about our work. And so we really need to try to figure out that challenge so that we can move the needle with the work that we do. And I'm just here to tell you that those people are out there. The stakeholders that you need to engage are out there. They just don't always fully understand the work that you do. They might be distracted by other things going on in their lives, especially right now, whether it's getting food on the table or helping their kids go to virtual school. People are very distracted, and so we have to think through how we're engaging them that way. And then, your role is to really help them understand and guide them to understanding your work and the importance of it and why you need their support. So just to reiterate, why do we need to listen to and guide our stakeholders, which is what I'll be talking about in this session? It's because we're human beings. We're complicated, we're quirky, we aren't very predictable. And so we need some ways to really understand how people are perceiving our organization and work with them in a way that is also human. So some of the things I'm going to cover today, we'll talk about why we need to do this a little more in depth, why I need to step outside your expertise and listen to your stakeholders. We'll talk about how to define engagement, which is a really buzzy word. So we'll get a little more concrete around that and define it specifically for your organization. And then we'll talk about how to guide your stakeholders from lackluster followers to passionate supporters of your work. So the agenda today, I'll talk a bit in the beginning and really talk about some of these mindset shifts that we need to make. We'll go into what engagement is, and then by 2 o'clock we'll start your own engagement ladder, and we're going to be doing some breakout rooms so that you'll be able to discuss some of what you've discovered with others in the room, and then share as a big group. Oh, I see some birds singing. I've already noticed just this week some more birds outside my window. So I've been very excited for that. Okay, so I have a few topics that I wanted to discuss to kind of get you in this right mindset. And the first idea is this idea of bottom up versus top down. So traditionally, societies and organizations have been top down. There's a lead, visionary person, whether it's a king or queen or a strong opinionated person as the head of an organization that really tells people, what to do and how to move forward. But we're finding society as we become more inclusive and become more, build more equity in the world, people are getting more used to this idea of a bottom-up organization. And when we think about companies like Starbucks and Uber, they've really been starting this trend of listening to their audience and watching how their audience behaves and adjusting their offerings based on that. And just because those are big, for-profit companies doesn't mean that it isn't relevant for nonprofits as well. For instance, Microsoft had a statistic recently. It said 77% of for-profit companies customers of for-profit companies had a more positive view of an organization when it asked for feedback. And those people are the same people that are engaging with your organization. So we need to start thinking about ways you can build in that bottom-up process. Again, this is not to have tons of cooks in the kitchen and have people make decisions for your mission, but is how are you listening to and gathering feedback from people? So just to give you a more concrete example around that, think of healthcare. Doctors are obviously experts at what they do. They can assess a patient's issues and figure out the best ways to help them. But when doctors work in a top-down method, they're not always paying attention to some of the other maybe less seen needs of a patient, perhaps their fear of getting a treatment such as a shot, their cultural differences that might not allow them to understand things in the same way, and even just understanding the treatments and why they're even necessary. And so we're seeing that a lot with vaccinations right now. There's a lot of misinformation and fears, and if we don't pay attention to those things, the doctor's treatment doesn't happen, and the patient doesn't get better. So just to put it in juxtaposition, when doctors' offices start to pay more attention to how patients are feeling, what they're thinking, offering more comfortable waiting spaces, asking more questions, and being more open-minded, and allowing that bottom-up process to continue, they can figure out how they need to communicate their recommendations to a patient in a way that really allows for more compliance. And so the same is true for your organization in thinking of like, you are the expert, you are that doctor, and how are you connecting to that patient or your stakeholder in a way that is relevant to them. Actually, as I was running through this presentation earlier, my 6-year-old daughter saw this first picture and was like, ah, and I showed her this picture and she went, oh yes. So it's just a clear reminder of how environments and communication can tell very different stories that can help change people's acceptance. So the second kind of mindset area I wanted to get around is this idea of the curse of knowledge. So I know all of you are very knowledgeable about what you do. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of knowledge about the environment and sciences and effects of things on each other. And so it takes a lot of work to get there. But what happens is we become more expert at what we do. It makes it more difficult to then explain to a non-expert. So if you imagine, you are a master at, knowing like Illinois birds and their ecosystems, and someone else might, be really great at, financial management. Now, if they would try to explain their work to you, imagine, assuming you're not as financially expert as I am, they might have to really break it down and explain things in a way that is outside of their expertise. And so the same is true for you. It's like it's just difficult for us as humans to unlearn what we know, and so we have to kind of get into that mindset of how do we step outside of our expertise for a moment to remember what it was like to not know. If you have children and you've ever had to teach them how to eat, it can seem really challenging at first when you forget like how to hold the spoon, how to find your mouth. Those are the things that we've learned over time and are very natural to us right now. And so that's a similar process. So I wanted to, and I'm actually going to stop share. I'm going to do a little exercise to demonstrate this. And again, if you guys can turn on your videos, I always love to be able to see people. So I'm going to do a little clapping exercise. So I'm going to clap a very well-known song, and I want you guys in the chat to see if you can guess what the song is. So you should know it. Hopefully there's not delays on this, but I'm going to give it a go. Okay, ready? And as soon as you know it, type in the chat. Let's see if there's any guesses. Oh, yep. All right. Yes. Very good. So we got some guesses. Was anyone stumped? Yeah, sorry, the sound, and the sound doesn't always translate very well over Zoom. Okay, well, we had some guesses, and And I'll say if this sound isn't working for you guys, try this at home with someone else in your household. Pick a song that you both know and clap it and see if they can guess it. So now I'm just going to do it one more time. The song was Happy Birthday. So we did have some correct guesses. And now, if you can hear it, once you know it's Happy Birthday, it's very hard to not hear that anymore. So I'll do it one more time and try to think if it could be any other song. Okay, so that is just an example of when you don't know the song, it is much harder to hear it. Once you know it, you can't unhear it almost. And so, like I said, I would encourage you to try it at home with somebody, because it is amazing. And maybe with like a slightly less well-known song, it is amazing how hard it is for people to guess these things, and how hard it is for you to not hear how obvious it is once you know what it is. So it's just, like I said, a simple way to illustrate some of these challenges of how hard it is to unknow. Okay, and then the last category of mindset shifts is this idea of unknown motivators. So when we want to engage our stakeholders, we might have ideas of what would engage them, and we might ask them what will engage them. That's what these little bubbles here represent. But the truth is, people don't always know what will engage them. If you've ever had an event and someone said, oh, if it was just free, I'd go, and then you make it free and then they don't show up. That is the kind of thing that people are complex and they don't always know what will motivate them. So click on this again. So kind of like a scientist, we need to experiment. A scientist doesn't always know. They run experiments because they don't know the results. And so when we can get ideas out in front of people, then people can react to them. In the same way, with a science experiment, we have a hypothesis of what might work, and we can test it out. We can prototype it and test it and see if it works. The same is true here, is when you can get some ideas out there and maybe not fully develop a program, or just have some loose ideas and get them out in front of people, we can see the reactions, and those reactions are hold a lot more weight than someone just filling out a survey and saying what they might do. So, when we allow people to have these choices and gather their feedback on them, that can really help us decide what parts of our program will work, will engage people in the way that we want them to. So the kind of overall picture here that I'm painting is that the mindset shift I'd like you to make, if you take one thing away from today, it is instead of just telling people what you do and why it is so important, because I know it is very important for our society, I want you to think about shifting that conversation to be more back and forth, so that you are letting people know, what your mission is, what the challenges you're facing are, but you're also listening to them and understanding where they're at in getting that challenge, and trying to understand what they need to hear in order to motivate them. And I think about this a lot, like learning to play a guitar. When you learn to play guitar, you don't go and play the most complicated, nerdy guitar song out there. You want to play, the Taylor Swift, the Stairway to Heaven, the kind of catchy song that just gets you excited. And so as people come into our organization, we need to figure out where they're at so that we can give them the right information to be passionate about playing that guitar, and not just, lose enthusiasm after a few tries. We want to really build up their knowledge, build up their understanding, and help them be more passionate about what we do. So I'm just going to pause for a moment there before we get into the workshop component of this. Susan, I don't know if we saw if there were any questions people had, but I'll pause too if people want to just even come off mute and ask a question at the moment.
Don't see any right now yet, Emily, but let's see what we get.
Thanks for checking. Okay, so at this point, in our notes, and coming up to this, I mentioned to bring some Post-it notes if you have them. You know, get out your Post-it notes, or if you just have some scraps of paper, that will also do. What we want is we'll have some pieces where you can, and some space where you can move some notes around as we think about an engagement ladder for your own stakeholders. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And the reason I put dessert here is I want you to think about, you know, engaging people like going to a restaurant. I know that has been very limiting for a lot of us over the last year, but when you think about entering a restaurant, you don't always know if you're going to have dessert, but the restaurant gives you a certain experience. They ask you, you know, they kind of tempt you with different foods. They ask you what you would like. They have different offerings, and at the end, you know, they offer you dessert. And so as you think about like building up your passion for your stakeholders, how can you get them to dessert? You don't just start off there. You have to build the appetizers, the meal, the environment, the friendliness and service in order for them to purchase that dessert. And so it's a process. It is a path. It's not an interaction. You know, you can be an ice cream truck if you want to just sell desserts, or you can be experience driven and really lead people towards that dessert, that final outcome that you want people to participate in. Okay, so I mentioned we were going to cover engagement. And as I read this, if you have your own definition of engagement, I would love to see that in the chat. How do you define engagement? Because it is, you know, it's something we use for a lot of different things, and it can be very confusing. So this is actually the dictionary definition. To offer something such as one's life or word as backing to a cause or aim, to expose to risk for the attainment or support of some end. That's what I think of that definition. It's just really confusing and hard to, you know, again, it is a dictionary definition, not what we need for our organization. And so how I like to think of engagement is it's someone taking an action towards your mission. So if we start to see all parts of engagement as moving towards our mission, then we can start to see engagement as a path. And I say that because we want to count all kinds of engagement, that liking on a social media platform, that following us on our newsletter, attending the first virtual or in-person event. Those are all forms of engagement, but you want to think about those as always leading towards the engagements you really want, the volunteering, the advocacy, the donating. And so when we start to see those as pieces of this longer path of engagement, we can start to take them for what they are, that we're not going to settle for people just staying there, that we want to move them along, but they're also still very important elements of that process. Okay, so another thing I just wanted to re-mention, this mindset shift, because as we start to think about engagement for your stakeholders, your organization, it is about what those stakeholders are doing, what action are they taking. So for instance, if you would give an example of, we engage by making phone calls to our stakeholders. Well, that is you engaging with someone else. What their engagement is whatever you're asking them to do. Is it is it to come to an event? Is it to join their board? Or to your board? And so those are very different types of engagement. And we want to instead think about the actions that those stakeholders are taking. So the first step in this workshop is to be thinking about who you want to engage. I tend to use audience broadly. They're your followers. They could be members. They could be visitors, donors, volunteers. And so I want to first think about like the particular challenges that you're facing and what group of stakeholders most can affect that change. So think about them. And what I'm really trying to get to here is to not just say the whole wide world and everybody, because when we say everybody, we end up speaking to nobody. And so when the tighter we can really visualize that audience that you want to engage, it doesn't mean you don't have other audiences or a broader audience, but let's just first think about who can make the biggest impact on your challenges right now. So think about them. And what I want you to do is start filling out your Post-it notes for how those people are taking action. What actions are they taking to engage with your organization? Again, this can be as simple as liking something in social media, all the way up to making a large donation, joining your board, putting you in their will. Start to think about this. And so I'm going to keep talking while you're working, just to give you ideas and to just kind of expand on this and fill some of the silence. But I want you to keep going. And just so you know, we'll walk through this and we'll have time to share. But I'll also give you the opportunity to take a worksheet home with you so that you can do this on your own, because this is not a 1-hour process. It'll take a lot more time, but this will give you a taste for how to go about it. So as you start filling those out, think about how you might sort these. So there might be some elements. I need to go backwards here. I feel like some elements that are, an initial interaction from this group of stakeholders that you have an idea of. And then there's some that are like the furthest out, what you'd love everybody to be, the most engaged. And then you're going to start to have a few notes in the middle. So I want you to start thinking about them in that way, that you're kind of starting to build a timeline, not a timeline, but a path. And in the middle, you're going to have sort of a mess of ideas, and see if those start to fit into groups. Are there elements which show people are maybe closer to that initial interaction, or the elements that kind of show that they're further along in engagement? See if you see an order to them. And I'm just going to stop share for a second and see if anyone's got some of these down, if they would like to share some of the engagement ways, some of the ways they're engaging these stakeholders. So I saw someone ask for examples. Does someone want to share their example in the chat?
Emily, I can share what I've written down.
Sure, love to hear it.
So I think you kind of kicked it off for me with the social media, that remote engagement, and we're talking about that at a roundtable tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow for tomorrow's session. So that's been a particularly useful tool for organizations this year. Next level up I had was an event participant, and then a volunteer. And then within our volunteer program, we've kind of a stratified leadership structure so that eventually volunteers can lead programs and lead, work days and that kind of stuff. working all the way up through introductory board involvement to a really high level advisory role.
And Emily, I see some things in chat too. We have from John, inviting someone to take a hike. From Judy, invite someone to coffee or lunch. And from Joanne, volunteering, asking questions, and sharing experiences.
Those are great. And I just wanted to remind everyone, because this is one of those, the tricky mind shift I was talking about before, is let's think about what is the action the stakeholder's taking. So if you're inviting someone to take a hike, that or maybe you did mean that they were inviting a friend to take a hike, but that's just something to clarify. We're looking at what action they are taking. Inviting someone to coffee or lunch, if that is something you're doing, think about the action that you're wanting that stakeholder to take. Are you inviting them to coffee or lunch to make a donation? Are you inviting them, to join your board? Yeah, donating to a fundraising appeal. And even as Ryan was mentioning, the social media, thinking specifically, because there's a variety of ways people can engage in social media. They can like your organization, they can comment on posts, they can help you produce a post, maybe give a quote to share. Those are different levels of engagement all within social media. Yeah, bringing a friend to an event, those are really great ways that people can take an action that will help build advocacy. Okay, so I'm going to keep giving you more ideas to keep filling that out, but these are all great. So as you start to fill these out, you're going to find that they tend, not always, so this isn't meant to be a limiting thing, that they fit these 6 common stages of engagement. So I'm going to mention these. These will be in the worksheet. So don't feel like you need to fully write these down or understand them right now, but I want you to sort of use them to help you think of additional ways people might be engaging with you right now. So the first stage is observing. How are stakeholders finding out about your organization? They didn't know about it, now they do. How did they find out? Did they see a poster? Did they, did a friend tell them about it? What are ways that they are now coming into an observing role? The second is following. So how are they staying in touch with your organization? They're aware of you, but now they actually want to continue to get updates and information. So they might, the most common would be following a newsletter that you send out or following social media, but it could also be regular events that you host to update people, perhaps monthly meetings that you have to update your stakeholders. The third area is how are stakeholders associating themselves with your organization? So they're not just kind of like behind a wall watching you. They're actually willing to get out there and be seen with your organization. They might comment or share a post. They're endorsing what you're doing. The fourth area is how are stakeholders taking an action that directly supports your mission? So I think the most exciting one is always making a donation, supporting you in some way with their resources, whether it's volunteering, but they're somehow contributing to your mission. They might be helping advocate for you with a local elected official, but they're really, this is where we start to get into the good stuff of people really taking action for your mission. The next stage is owning. How are stakeholders taking responsibility for your mission? And so this might be that they are helping you support some of your work, maybe helping plan an event, maybe writing a perspective piece that you can publish socially, but they're taking charge of something. And then lastly is leadership. And this is where they're really helping you multiply your work. It's almost like having another set of hands and ears and eyes out there. They might be leading a volunteer group. They might be hosting a donation dinner at their home. They might be joining your board. All things that are kind of like the most they could really do to engage. So again, just to give you some ideas on how to think about this, I'll be posting these up later so you can see them. So what I want you to do is start thinking about those elements, these 6 stages, and how the Post-it notes that you're creating, how they fit on that path. And it's okay to just take a guess for now. This is a process, and there's no, well, there can be right or wrong answers, but we're all figuring it out right now. So I'm going to go through a few real world examples as well, so that you can start to see how some of these come to life. But what I want you to be doing is thinking about where are there gaps in your engagement. You know, as you start to fill this out, oftentimes what I see is that there are areas where maybe you're doing a lot to bring people into your organization, but not necessarily moving them to contributing, or maybe you've really got your strong followers and you've figured out how to really get them to contribute and lead, but you need to grow your organization with a new audience. And so look for those gaps. Look and see where you're maybe a little light in Post-it notes along this ladder. And then the other thing I want you to start thinking about is how can you guide people from one engagement to the next. So this is where you come in. We've had a list of actions other people are taking, but how can you help them get there? How can you help them want to order that dessert later on? So this is what, again, don't feel bad if you haven't gotten to this point, but that's what I want one of your goals to be is, if these pink Post-it notes represent the actions people are taking, the orange Post-it notes represent what you can do to guide people from one stage of engagement to the next. And so what I'm going to do now is, as I promised, talk through some examples so that you can see some real world examples of how you can see how people went from getting stuck to guiding people to that next phase of engagement. Okay, I need to take a sip of water. All right. So my first example is a national cycling organization that I worked with, and they really struggled with broadening the diversity of participants going through their cycling training, learning how to cycle in an urban environment. And so what I did, they're having people sign up, but not necessarily go through the whole program. They were getting stuck. So I went out and talked to leaders in various communities, and just discovered that as people talked about the challenges people of color faced in their programs, they just had this feeling that it wasn't for them. And so what we did is we went back and broke down the interaction points in the program and improved each to be less full of cycling, nerdy jargon, really have more diverse photos that included a broader population so people could see themselves both in the promotion of the program, but also in the lessons themselves, and also sought networks to help support those students. So when we look at this through a stages of engagement lens, what we're really doing is helping with that early stage of engagement, people to, they had an interest, they were willing to look into the cycling program, but not make it all the way through. And so they were getting stuck in feeling like they were a part of the organization. And this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before about that bottom-up approach. By listening to people, we were able to hear what they weren't getting from the experts. And this was a sign of inclusion. It was an understanding of this jargon that was happening. And so by simplifying that, I shouldn't say simplifying, but making that message more clear and in a language the people they wanted to engage understood, they were able to help move people to further engage with that organization and get on that bike and start to better understand that world. Second example I have is an arts organization that I've worked with. They were frustrated that the popularity of their events wasn't turning into broader support for their organization. They were sort of being seen as an entertainment venue and not as a nonprofit. And I've seen a variety of nonprofits struggle with this. And so what we found is that we needed to turn those events into something different. They needed to go beyond just about the art and the artists, because they weren't really differentiating themselves from another, ticketed event at a for-profit event. So the solution that we did with them is we developed different strategies. We created some prototype statements that talked about the larger goals and mission of the organization. And they're currently testing these with their audience to see which statements, help lift people into that area of philanthropy and see the organization as something more than just entertainment. So this is that science, the prototype and testing approach that I mentioned. And so when we think about stepping back to our engagement ladder, this was where people were ready. They were endorsing the organization. They were coming to the events regularly, having a great time, telling their friends, but we needed to move them to contributing. So they needed to understand and be reminded of the bigger picture. This organization was not just about showcasing artists. It was also about incubating them and growing unknown artists into and really helping them I can't remember the word, fertilize their ideas and bring them to that next level. So they were able to, like I said, they're currently testing this, but this is going to allow them to now talk about these things at events and make their events remind people of that difference. And the last example here is turning passions into long-term activism. So I was supporting this, a local arboretum, and they were having gangbusters growth, which was great. They had a lot of new members, were really growing, but they wanted to make sure they were moving those new members to being long-term supporters. And as we talked to long-term supporters and tried to understand their connections with the organization, we started to realize that they were feeling disconnected as the organization started to be more accessible. And this was, they were trying to really connect with that big, broader new audience that was coming in. And so they were talking about more simplified versions of their work. They were having events that maybe were a little more fun and, going back to the guitar analogy, the pop song that you want to learn at first. And they weren't talking about all the other research and deeper work that they were doing. So the solution here was they found they couldn't communicate the same information to their entire audience. They had to give a more nuanced, more behind the scenes information to these long-term supporters and figure out who was ready to be moved into that, that information stream so that they could really go, into these later stages of engagement to owning and leading, because they understood more about what the Arboretum was doing, and they got more information about how it was really researching and innovating and moving the needle on their mission, where the earlier supporters were not, the people in the observing following were not quite ready for that yet. So this is going back to your engagement ladder. This is what it should start to be looking like. And if you don't have different colored Post-it notes, you could just put a little star on the actions that you are taking versus the actions that, the ways you're lifting people up to that next rung or stage versus action they're taking. And we're going to go into breakout rooms. So I want you to think about, what's your biggest engagement gap? As you filled this out, are you perfect? Like, do you have people moving all the way through? Or is there a spot where you feel like could use a little help? So I want you to share those with your small group. And then I want each of you to share ideas about how you might fill that gap. So we'll have, let's see what time it is. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes in your breakout rooms. So, spend about a minute explaining your gap, and then give people a couple of minutes to brainstorm some ideas, and then we'll move on to the next person. So I'll send time updates to keep you focused on that. Put this picture to make us all jealous of what breakout rooms used to look like. But this is the idea. So we'll have you in smaller groups of about 4 to 5. Is that still true, Ryan?
Yes, that's correct. And
okay.
I'm a little nervous. I've never sent the breakout rooms.
All right, we will have.
Okay, Ryan, come on. This is it. Everything's been going great so far.
We'll have our fingers crossed.
I'll come back, but we'll be in the main room if you need us.
Yeah, let us know if you have any technical challenges, and I'll come into the different rooms just to see how you're doing, and then look in the chat where I'll post those questions again so you have them, as well as the times that should be moving on to the next person. All right, with that, let's give it a go.
Right.
So come back on with your videos if you have them off so people can see you.
I think it's working.
Off the other, went somewhere. Can't tell if everyone is on or not. Okay, I'm just going to put questions to answer in the chat. Awesome. So how many rooms do we have?
I did 8 because we had a precipitous drop at the invitation of breakout rooms. So I did 8.
Oh.
A bunch of people jumped off.
Okay. Not everyone was ready for that.
And I see a couple people here are in.
Yeah, they might not be at their desks. So let me just write down. We have 5 per group, and it is 216.
I'm gonna move the folks that haven't gone yet. I'm gonna go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Oh, it doesn't let me. Let's see. What's your end time, Emily? Or 5?
Oh, for the breakout rooms?
Yeah.
I had between 2:35 and 2:40. So let me just see if that. Sorry, I'm trying to.
I think we sent them about 2:15. So if we want to give them 15 minutes or 20 minutes, maybe we'll send a. Just let me know when you want to send the 5-minute warning.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm gonna send just some shorter warnings. So we'll do every 4 minutes. I'm just gonna write. I wasn't sure what time we would get to this point, so I. So I think we'll go back at 2:35.
I'm muted, sorry. I'll send a 10-minute warning at 25 and a 5-minute warning at 2:30.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to send out a. Actually, Ryan, maybe we'll skip that because I'm going to send out just a note on to switch people.
To switch people?
Like I'm going to like give them the time to switch to the second, allow the second person to talk,
Oh,
third person to talk. So
got
I
it.
think that should be
Okay.
enough.
I'll just stand by.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to go and see how people are doing.
Hey, Emily. Do you think it would be helpful for people to see that one slide with the 6 stages of engagement while they're talking about this? You're on mute.
There's not really a way to show them a slide, but I will, I'll post the 6 stages in the chat.
I have a screenshot that I could put as a picture in there, but whatever you think is easiest. I don't have the handout too that you mentioned before. That they would be. Is that something they download from their website? From your
Send it to people. That's something I was going to do at the end. Is if anyone wants to give me their emails, I can email it to them.
Perfect.
Or you can post it somewhere if you'd like.
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm gonna try another room.
Are they talking?
Yeah. People. I just been into one room so far, but they were.
Should I give them a 10-minute warning at this point?
All right, that room was looking good.
Nice. Oh, that just went to me.
Oh, it must default there. When I go to a breakout room and come back, I get mute, kind of like redo all the things. Okay. Okay, what other room should I go into? Try this one.
Okay, this went good.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. It's going real good, Ryan. It's going okay.
Yeah, I sent you an email. The video I'm gonna have to edit, or
All
somebody.
right.
Yeah, I accidentally ran it. It's been one video ever since David started talking. It's been hard. I'm like juggling so many things. The video thing has been tough to juggle today.
I know. But overall, it's going really well. It's going to be a little tricky on Friday. I'm glad Jamie's doing it because it's going to be a lot of shuffling around, but
right.
Sure it'll be okay.
Okay. Let's see.
All right.
How much longer do you think, Emily?
Just a few more minutes. I'm going to say, I'm just writing a note to everybody. Seems like most people are just having an open conversation. But yeah, if you want to give people I'd say a 4-minute warning at this point.
Okay.
How's everything been going so far?
It's good. What happens if I hit this broadcast message to all button?
It shows up like a little blue bar at the top of the screen.
That's what I'm going to do.
Okay. Yeah, it looks a little more official.
So you can tell everybody to come back.
Yeah, then I think once you hit bring people back, did you set it for 60 seconds?
I'm just saying it said I'm writing 3 minutes remaining.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I can see that up above. And then when you hit the, when we were on earlier this week, we set the timer for when you close. It gives people maybe 60 seconds. You can set the different times.
Oh, okay.
I can't remember what we ended up setting it at.
So when I hit close all rooms, will it give me that option?
It's something that was already set up. So when you close all rooms,
I don't know
I think the default is 60 seconds.
Okay. Well, I set a timer at 1 minute. I'll try and do that.
Okay. It'll automatically bring people back.
Okay, we got 1 more minute before I do that.
Okay. So I can stretch my legs here.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit close all rooms.
Great.
Yep. Here we go. 60 seconds.
Perfect.
By the way, Emily, I added the link that you had sent, like for that registration thing. We can remind everybody it's included in the agenda. There's an active link after your name, and if they click on it, it'll take them to that form that you had mentioned from before. So you can
okay.
tell everybody that. So
Excellent. Awesome. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Let's see. I think that should be everybody. All right. Well, now is the part that I want to hear how the conversations went. So I know I just got to pop into a few rooms, but I would love to have a volunteer share some new engagement idea that they got from a conversation. Anyone like to start before I call on people?
I'll start.
All right, thanks, Jen.
Peter from Lake Forest Open Lands mentioned that their community, like me, their city council does a 10-minute spotlight on different organizations. And so that was a neat idea to get the word out about your organization if it's not already out. So thank you, Peter.
Excellent. What was, did you find a challenge area in your engagement when you were working on it?
Well, for us, all of them,
Okay.
because we don't advertise and market, so to speak. So all of them really, but it was helpful to lay out with the circles and not just make a list, but actually move around the notes. I found that mentally helpful. So thank you.
Awesome. Wonderful. Paul, I saw you had to leave. Did you want to share anything quickly before you get your shot?
Three different organizations in our group. We all have, we think, our biggest challenges with getting people from being donors to being active participants, the owning and leading steps, and didn't come up with really great ideas. We did commiserate, at least. Aging populations, which has not helped us broaden the demographics of the people who are strong supporters. I think we really need to overcome that. See if Kim and Tyler nod with that, and Jill, my cohorts at Natural Land.
Okay. Anyone have ideas around that, of how moving people from donors to taking more action?
Oh, it was really the getting people, in our case, to the properties or events, and personal invitations.
Well, that's what. Yeah. Go
Not
ahead.
just assuming that sending a newsletter is going to be enough.
Did anyone else have a similar challenge and come up with an idea?
So we've been, Parkland's been having family-friendly events, which gets a nice demographic out there in terms of the kids, from the kids to the parents to the grandparents. And that's been very helpful. We really, a few years ago, established an outreach committee that's been really powerful. And that has been one of the best things that's happened in terms of involving more people. And then as they come and enjoy these places, of course, we try to recruit them to pony up at different levels. Either through their time or their finances or whatever, but that's how we've been trying to expand our demographic, at least age-wise.
Can you talk a little bit about what that outreach committee is?
Well, we established it under leadership of one of our past presidents, who actually runs the Illinois State Horticulture Unit and is used to doing a lot of this. And we got a few really committed board members who are really keen on doing this, and as we had more and more successes, it drew more people in to do it. And it's now become, I would say, one of our strongest committees that continues doing more and more things because we've seen just the success of it all. Before we were so focused primarily on stewardship and the like, which we still are in a big way, but this was also just expanding. Stewardship sort of requires some level of knowledge, whereas the outreach requires a different level of commitment and knowledge. And we were really tapping into new people who wanted to do that and saw it as a fun thing. And younger people too really enjoyed it.
That's wonderful. Judy, did you have something you wanted to share or add to that?
Well, we did have started a program about 14 years ago. It was a fundraiser called Party on the Prairie, and we actually decided that we needed to bring people out to our showcase property, which is Niagara and Wetland, to show them what we had and why we do what we do. And so people were encouraged to buy a table and invite people that were not familiar with the organization to come and enjoy the prairie. And we had wagon rides and walking tours through the property. And I think over the years, we've built a lot of new donors and just members through that.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, we've also tried to attract a younger demographic also with doing another event out there called the Wine and Brew event. And in our group, Abby from the Conservation Foundation, she's new there, but she was talking a little bit about a group they've just started for younger people. I don't know, Abby, if you want to share the little bit that you know about that.
It's our Next Gen Council, so it's kind of an advisory team made up of folks. I think we said under 40. I think we said, it was like a millennial age group to help keep the organization relevant to younger people.
Have you created any engagement opportunities through that group?
Yes. Well, it was formed officially as of about 2 weeks ago. And we have our first meeting this afternoon after this, so that's why it was top of mind for me. We've got them hosting a nature-themed trivia night as part of our Earth Day benefit month to give them kind of a project to run with right off the bat. And they seem excited about it, so.
Yeah, that does sound like fun. Well. Awesome. Let's see, I think, Bob, I'd wanted you to share something you were telling us.
Thanks, Emily. Well, we were commiserating about the intense use of some of the preserves that we all make available to the public. Have the use they've sustained over the past year, and not all of the use is good, and we've had to take action, a corrective action, to sort of respond to misuse, and it was sort of a common theme, I think, for all of us. And people react to how you're reacting, and not always favorably. But we sort of landed that type of reaction, if you will. Even I think, Emily, you said, that anger is passion, and what we become interested in is how we turn that caring, how that expression of passion about these properties can be, how you can transform that into positive action on our behalf. And it's, I think it's currently a gap. We've explored some ideas. I'm intrigued by the idea of sort of creating a small local council that could advise you, even if it's one person, maybe that's a start. Communicating effectively, asking them what they see. Anyway, a variety of ideas sort of surface that are a bit raggedy at the moment, but of interest, because we really want to turn people's reaction to our needs into, positive conservation results.
Excellent. Yeah, that's sounds like a challenge. It could be turned into a form of listening and really expand on how to engage that group.
Emily, I didn't get into a breakout, but what Bob said really, I think, connects with what you started off this presentation on, with thinking about how the stakeholders engage from their end. And I think especially with all the use in the preserves, they might not necessarily realize that they're in that first level, that observing level, and how do we best connect with them? So that was really interesting to hear.
Yeah, Carrie.
So to follow on from that comment, one of the things that we talked about at length was partnerships and how we have to think about our partnerships in our community in a different way. We have to do a lot of listening, maybe even start to focus on strategic partnerships and be open to a concept of maybe doing things differently, having different perspectives. And if it's going to be something that's coming from the bottom up, how do we broaden that base? How do we take a look at what Emily had been talking about about our geek speak, so that we actually are talking with a common language about values, things that are important to us, and going out and meeting people at their table instead of always asking people to come to our table. I think that's also important. Yeah, we can have these events and bring people to our preserves and things, but maybe that's actually the second step. That maybe the first step is that we go out and start to create these strategic partnerships where we can leverage our resources because we have limited capacity to do these things, and we have to keep that in mind. So it's like, well, what do we want to do anyway? Who can we find to help us do this, to expand our base, to reach and touch more people? So I think that's really critical, especially reaching and touching people outside of our own demographic, and not just underserved areas, but also in places where we maybe haven't traditionally worked, like urban areas, agricultural community, all those kinds of things, working with Black and Brown people and making sure that these partnerships are strategically focused to not just achieve our goals and our mission, but to be able to expand our mission impact.
That's great, Carrie. And I love what you said about meeting at their table. I think that creates a nice visual for reframing, reframing engagement.
Dave Holman has his hand up. Dave?
Just wanted to say, for those who haven't seen it, the Conservation Foundation did a great piece, put out a great piece a year or two ago, speaking to what Carrie was just talking about, using the right language when you're not speaking to the choir. Brooke can probably speak to that more. I thought it was a really, really useful document and very insightful, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, that was that polling research we did.
Yeah.
Where we polled voters in the 6 collar counties and compared, this was in April of 19, and we compared the messages and the data for the previous 20 years before that to see how the messages change and stuff. But I mean, I think this is an important thing in our field in general, is that, we all are passionate about what we think people should know about. And if they only knew what we knew, they'd get it. We've got to, we have to listen to the data. The data tells us what all those people out there care about, and we need to get to where they're at, not expect them to get to where we're at.
Did you have any particular lessons that came out of that research?
Yeah, I mean, it's it was nothing super surprising. It's just that we have to connect. Most of the people here have heard me say this, but we have to connect what we do in preserving land to what people care about. People do care about preserving land, but they also care about places that they can go. They care about clean water, clean air. They want to drink clean water. They want to breathe clean air. They want to be around wildlife. They want to have wildlife near them. So we need to constantly be thinking about how we can connect what we do as Conservation Land Trust to what they care about and what is meaningful to them, not what we think should be meaningful to them. And we've got to separate our emotions and our passions with just looking at what the data says, because it's right there in front of us. It's pretty clear. I mean, when all these open space referenda pass, I mean, they pass for a reason, and we use these messages to pass referenda for $1.5 billion over the past 25 years. Why would we ignore that data? It works.
So Brooke, are you saying that, in a sense, that the idea of inclusiveness doesn't mean people have to be included in our point of view? It means that we create this new way of thinking or paradigm that includes all points of view.
Yes, and I mean we have to ask more questions and listen rather than talk to people about what we think they should know.
Yeah, and I'll just
got to broaden that group, and I just when you do survey or polling, you're asking questions and you're listening to what people say, and then if you don't take action on that information, you just wasted your time.
Yeah, and I think to kind of build on what you were saying, Carrie, I think it does depend on your, the more you broaden that message, you want to figure out who is in that audience that you're talking about. Because if they are, newer people that are just observing or not knowing about your organization, that survey may have covered a wider audience, but if you're really trying to focus on those new people, really honing in on what's that message that hooks them, and then as you bring them down, what is the additional information to get them to know more and become more expert at your mission and the work that you're doing. And so that's where, when I had that picture of the black and white picture of like tons of people, it can get really overwhelming when you just try to think of connecting with everybody. And I think we can take that data, like the surveys that are being done, but we can also try to focus on certain segments that we feel like can move the needle the most, and listen to them, through surveys or through just one-on-one listening, conversations, some of these ideas like the committees, to bring in that perspective so you can kind of figure out where people are at and what they need to know at that point.
And I think what we're seeing bearing out too is how important it is at the community level to let the community define what the protection and programming of a space is. And it starts with them envisioning how they can infuse their voice and identity into place. And then as basically shepherds for us to be able to figure out how to make that a reality by working with the agencies that we do, to be able to carry their voice, carry their identity, to thread it through our solutions with them. So even going beyond listening, which is absolutely critical, how do we elevate their voice and what they perceive as the most important thing for the landscape? And that then weds them more tightly to that landscape in a way that they really care about. And it gives them basically it shines a spotlight on that place. Like we're hoping in the Chicago River, for instance, wouldn't it be wonderful if neighborhoods along the riverfront were a reflection of their history and their identity, right? So I think it also takes re-envisioning how we actually do acquisition work.
Yeah.
Emily, it looks like Jen has her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have time for one more comment. So Jen, what do you want to share?
Well, I just wanted, in relation to what Carrie said, that was all really good. We could probably go on for a long time, but we're sitting at someone else's table. Does anyone have examples of how you did that? Looks like we have some work to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I put in the chat early on was going to other people's events, becoming involved to some extent in their organizations, listening to their concerns and what they're doing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, it's much easier to use someone else's momentum than start your own. And so, if you can find populations that you are trying to reach out to and figure out what is already going on in their communities, be it block parties or church groups, or anything of the sorts, like if they've already built the momentum and built that trust, how can you kind of come in and start to introduce yourself to them? So with that, I know there's lots to discuss, but I love that you guys, it seems like you really have taken that mindset shift that I mentioned of making things a two-way street versus just talking to people about your expertise. But we need to find ways to share that expertise because it's so important that people do learn about your work. So with that, I'm just going to kind of close out here. We did this part already. I'm just going to review a few things. So really thinking about, we started the structure of your engagement ladder. I want you to be thinking about ways you're guiding people. So those are the actions people are taking. How are you asking them to join a mailing list, donate to a specific cause? Make sure you're asking, but also, giving the right information at the right time. Sorry, I guess this is what the slide is. So you're asking them, you're giving them it might be the impact numbers of your work or how your work fits into the bigger picture of the world and our planet, or a personal story, or how your work affects their community. And sometimes it might just be fun stories so they can learn things about your work. It doesn't necessarily always have to be tied back to a passion. People just like to learn. And so these are different strategies you can use for connecting with people. And then going on to the kind of that next step is, how are you listening? Are you asking open-ended questions? Are you scheduling one-on-one interviews so you are creating those opportunities to listen and knowing what you want to learn when you go into those so you can ask the right questions? Interacting with people on social media, as we talked about, those naysayers can be great people to turn into passionate supporters. They just need to better understand what you're doing and why. Sending short surveys, so not always doing these big annual surveys, but think about just sending a few 2 or 3 questions in an email and getting that feedback throughout the year so that you're keeping a pulse on people. And also leaving space at the end of events to ask questions, gather feedback, just give people that opportunity to share. In addition to all we think there's some really great ideas at the end of this session too, like with the committees and such. And so I just wanted to end that, I do help people create their engagement. I call them maps because beyond just a ladder, we do think about those whys and what you're telling people. What are your engagement stages? Who are you reaching out to? And how do you fill in those gaps? And then making sure that they are working. So if you are interested in learning more, as well as I have a worksheet that will help you fill out, gives you all the spaces to fill in both these actions and ways to lift people. You can put your email in the chat and I'll send those directly to you along with other free things that I offer. I do some monthly discussions where we can talk about some of these mindsets and how we're connecting with people and engaging our audience. So you can drop those into the chat, but I'll make sure Ryan has this worksheet too. So if you're not interested in that, we'll find a way to get that to you. And with that, I just wanted to thank you. Thank you for coming and listening and learning. And I really wish you well in reaching out to people and doing this important work. I know this year has been really tough in many different ways. And so really, if there's any questions you have or ways I can help you think through 2021, feel free to reach out and check out my website. I have a few different resources for people. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. I know, and I'm a subscriber to Emily's blog and her updates. I encourage everybody to do that. I've learned a lot this year. I was first introduced to Emily right before the quarantine started with COVID a little over a year ago. So I hope everybody enjoyed their first day. Please mark your schedule for 12 o'clock, the same time tomorrow. Take a look at the evaluation form that was in the chat as well. We welcome your review of this first day, and especially this was, our part of our objective is to help provide tools for all of our members. And I know I picked up a couple new tools from this stakeholder workshop, but this was the first time we tried a longer format workshop. So curious to hear what you guys think about that, and looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.